Thank you. It's a thrill to be here. It's been a week since the book came out, and this is my first time talking about it publicly to a live audience. So we'll see how this goes. I'll get started not by talking about Seattle and all its challenges and all of its opportunities, but by something closer to home, which is I'd like to put you in your own mind in the moment that you last had to choose with your family where to go to dinner on a Friday night. It's an awkward conversation in many families because everyone has a different opinion. I have a wife and two gremlins, two teenagers, and when we decide sort of on a whim on a Friday night that we're going to go out to dinner, we immediately start into a conversation where it becomes very clear that there's some deep-seated feelings about what the opportunities are for each of us. My wife, who is not a vegetarian, always wants to somehow send us to a vegetarian place where we're going to be served, unseasoned quinoa or something like that. My older daughter insists only on going to restaurants that have fried chicken sandwiches, preferably holding the chicken. And my younger daughter, who's sort of a spark plug, wants always some weird place that'll have like donuts and sushi. And so this begins this conversation inside the family about where we're going to go and who should get to decide. And just sort of as a thought experiment, you can imagine lots of ways of resolving this. We could vote. Just the parents could decide. Everyone could have a chance, and we would, today would be my turn, and the next would be my wife's turn, and the next would. But all of these ways of deciding how we're going to provision this question of where we're going to eat have advantages and disadvantages. Government is a lot of things to a lot of people, but at root, it is a mechanism to make these sorts of decisions society-wide. It's a way for us all to decide together, have some system of deciding where the bridge is going to go, or who's going to suffer when we put up a new housing development, and who's going to benefit. Where are we going to put the transmission line that brings the clean energy into the city? And the argument of my book is essentially that we in America have had differing views. We've had sort of a different zeitgeist at different moments about what exactly the process should be of making those decisions. At the turn of the 19th century, turn of the 20th century, the late 1800s, early 1900s, what was clear was that the kids in the car deciding where to go to dinner had too much power. At the time, the kids were political machines, robber barons, people who did not have the greater public interest in mind. And the public figures, the elected officials, didn't have that much power. So at the time, the zeitgeist, with a burgeoning middle class in the middle of the beginning or the middle point of the Industrial Revolution, was to try to give more power to the grown-ups, to the people in the front of the car. Let them make the big decisions. That meant, for the most part, that we were going to professionalize government. It meant putting power in the hands of blue ribbon commissions, of true scientific experts. And this wasn't just in government, this was sort of society-wide. America was in a moment where we were looking for true experts in every realm. It's when bar associations were established, when academic disciplines came about, when the medical profession began to divide into specialties. We wanted real experts to act in public life. And in government, that meant blue ribbon commissions, it meant public authorities, all these institutions that were designed to push power above the level of political machines and sort of everyday, workaday politicians so that real professional experts would be in charge. In the early days, the sort of evidence of this was the creation of the Federal Reserve in Washington, the Federal Trade Commission during the Wilson administration. But it happened sort of all over the country. In cities, more and more groups like this, which I know that this particular organization began in 1958, but there were sort of chambers of commerce that began to be established around the country, and they would become sort of powerful figures in each civic community. In the Great Depression, it was this way of thinking, this notion that we should push power up into the hands of responsible bodies that would have real power, really took off because the country simply wasn't prepared for the economic devastation that existed, and the existing social safety net wasn't holding up. So during the Depression, many of us remember from high school, from our high school classes, that there was the Social Security Administration, the Works Progress Administration, a whole alphabet soup of programs, but maybe the quintessential New Deal program was the Tennessee Valley Authority. And the Tennessee Valley Authority was this remarkable institution that most of us don't really know much about, but it was designed to wire up all the poor farms in the Tennessee Valley, which is the Upper South, which had been neglected by private industry because they didn't believe that the load drawn by these poor farms would be worth the cost of extending the wires. And Roosevelt's intention was to dam various rivers, to reseed various forests, to remake the region and the people in it into sort of modern coastal people in an advanced society. And he gave the power to do that to essentially one single man. His name, now forgotten to history, was David Lilienthal, and he ran this huge organization that basically remade a region of the country the size of England. The TVA became a model, a sort of an intellectual model for decades after. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe after the Second World War, was the TVA for Europe. The Vietnamization decades after, when we were trying to rebuild Vietnam, was they were going to do a TVA for the Mekong Delta. Before he was assassinated, Martin Luther King wanted to do a Marshall Plan for the black community in America. So this idea of pushing power up into a big institution that would make big, powerful decisions sort of became a norm, an ideal, and people in the greatest generation certainly embraced it. What happened because we had this worldview and we were pushing power into these institutions is that something developed in America that hadn't existed before, and it's what we now know as the establishment. There was a phrase that was popular at the time, which was, "You can't fight City Hall." And Mr. Mayor, that didn't mean that you couldn't oust an incumbent mayor if they were unpopular. That happens from time to time. What it meant was that there were people in public life who were even more powerful than the mayor, or who sat behind the mayor. And no matter who was sitting in that chair, they could control what was going on in a city. And the establishment existed in sort of all realms of life. We had an image, America had an image of what these people looked like. They were generally men in their midlife. They wore charcoal suits and fedoras, and they looked like this, and they frowned with the weight of responsibility on their shoulders. And they were sort of an archetype. And the notion was, in the 1940s and 1950s, that they were the people who were going to find America's way forward, that they were sort of a crucial linchpin to moving the country forward. And then something began to happen. In the late 50s and beginning of the 60s, people began to question the establishment, began sort of on the fringe. There was a Columbia professor named C. Wright Mills who began writing about the power elite. Some of you will have read C. Wright Mills in high school or college. There were the beat poets. There was the New Left, who wrote the Port Huron Statement in 1962. And this group began to take the opposite view of the establishment. Their notion was that the problem wasn't that power was insufficiently concentrated in institutions that could make big change. It was that those institutions were themselves corrupt and that power needed to be returned to the people. And some of that was generational. Some of that was that these were boomers who hadn't lived through Depression, who hadn't seen the federal government or a local government really have dramatically positive impact on American life. But some of it was evidence that the establishment had in fact gone wrong. That was true in all sorts of facets of American life. Maybe the most obvious example during the 60s was Vietnam, a war that was pursued by the best and brightest was the term of derision used by David Halberstam to describe the sort of elite who led the foreign policy establishment at the time. It was in evidence when the agricultural establishment allowed us to use pesticides that caused terrible birth defects. It was evident in the impact of urban renewal, which was a program that Democrats and Republicans had supported in the 40s and 50s to basically tear down what people in the establishment viewed as slums and replace them with bigger, better housing. It was evident in Ralph Nader's famous book, Unsafe at Any Speed, which was about how the auto industry was building cars that weren't safe. And then finally, two things happened to sort of nail the coffin on the establishment. One was Watergate, which showed that the power elite in America really were corrupt. And the second was a book that was the inspiration for my book, which was a book called The Power Broker, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1974, about a fellow named Robert Moses, who had been the quintessential establishment figure in New York City for 30 or 40 years. He'd been never elected to any body, never been elected to office at all, but he had managed to find his way into very powerful positions across the board. He'd built highways and parks and housing developments. He'd built the Lincoln Center and the UN headquarters. He was just immensely powerful. And the most poignant story in his book was about his effort to build the Cross Bronx Expressway. Everyone opposed him. Everyone thought it was a mistake. And yet he just turned a deaf ear and built this trench through the South Bronx, turning it into what would later become sort of a symbol of the American urban wasteland. This sparked a sort of a cultural shift, these changes. And you could see it in the culture. You could see it in the movies. I don't know if many of you remember the movie Chinatown, which was a movie about a sort of an evil guy who steals water from the valley outside of LA and brings it into the city. Or you remember The Graduate and the guy who said plastics was the future. Remember Nurse Ratched in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or the tagline from the movie Network, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. Those were all stories about the establishment being bad rather than good. The cultural zeitgeist had changed by the 70s. And in reaction to that change, we in America began to hold a different worldview, which was solving our problems was not going to be fixed. We weren't going to fix our problems by pushing power up to powerful men, for the most part, who would do the bidding of the broader society. It would be fixed by pushing power down to ordinary people. So this is a story about moving power in the discussion among my family about where to eat dinner from the parents to the kids. And what would you do if you were a kid who wanted to have more weight to throw around when we were selecting restaurants? You would put restrictions on what I could choose as a parent, right? You would make a statement or a rule that we couldn't go to any restaurant that didn't have a fried chicken sandwich. And in essence, that's what reformers have done for the last 50 years. In each case, we've seen the abuse of power by the establishment and reacted by trying to put guardrails around what the establishment can do. And we've done that in all sorts of realms. I'm sure that everyone in this room has a story in their own mind about a moment that they saw government do something that seemed ridiculous and overdone, and we should just be able to get this done immediately, but we can't because of this regulation or that. But you've got a whole notion across the board. We've got environmental regulations. We've got zoning regulations. We've got historic preservation. We've got transit development norms. All of these well-intentioned because they were born from a notion that the Robert Moses establishment was bad. and that they needed to be held to account, and that we couldn't let them run rampant again. But over the course of 50 years of seeing every problem as a problem of too much power at the top, and finding a solution in putting new guardrails around that power, we've created a system in almost every realm of public life where there is simply too much procedure, and we can't get to a decision. The bad thing about the establishment was that only a few people could influence the decision, but those people had the discretion to decide. We now have a system where the opposite is true. Almost anyone can say no because they can find some part of the process of making a decision, of the procedures, where they can hold things up, where they can object. Sometimes those objections are legitimate, sometimes they're not, but overall we've lost the ability to ratify a trade-off. The bridge needs to be built somewhere. Whose home is going to be in the way of the base? We're going to have to take someone's home. Who's going to decide? We need to build clean energy. We need to bring clean energy from where it's generated, either offshore or solar power, hydro, you name it. There need to be transmission lines that bring that stuff into the places where it'll be used. Those power lines have to go somewhere. We need someone to be able to choose where that's going to go. The challenge today, and I'll try to keep this short so I give more time to future speakers, is that we have overcorrected for the problems that were made so apparent during the Robert Moses era. We've gone from a place where powerful figures had too much discretion to one where no one can say yes to a project. And the solution is not to say that we go back to the old Robert Moses era. It's to recognize that these are two legitimate, well-intentioned impulses. One, to empower those to decide. One, to protect those who can't protect themselves against the powerful. And we need to find some new balance between the two. So that's the central message of my book. It's not, I want to be clear, it's not that there is any single law that can be written here that would change this. It needs to be a different mentality among reformers of all types. We need both to protect those who are vulnerable and to empower those who can do things for the public and in the public interest. So I hope you'll see it that way. I hope I've given you some language and a way to think about this in a helpful way. And I say, I've been in your city for all of 24 hours. It's beautiful. You should be congratulated. I was thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to talk to you, and I hope to talk to you more about it soon. Thank you.